This chapter is intended for a target audience of adults. This chapter deals with heavy topics that may not be suitable for all audiences. For the sake of my channel, I've tried to make sure everything in here is PG-13 on all scales, so no gratuitous violence, sex, cursing, etc. But if you are a younger viewer, please keep this in mind. Trigger warnings: toxic/abusive relationships, animal cruelty, blood, religious content, death, suicide, mental illness, and hallucination. Previously on Feeding Habits. Chapter 3 Recap. Eliza takes Lonan to a beach to decompress, but Lonan ends up seeing a vision of his dead father. Lonan admits he wants to revisit his father in the only way he knows how, in the dark room at his cabin. Later, Lonan, unable to sleep, heads to the kitchen for a painkiller when he sees his father once again looking over a photo album. There are only copies of the same picture in the album, the photo of Eliza, Lonan, and his ex-boyfriend Harrison found in the dark room months previous. Lonan takes this as a sign that his life cannot progress with Eliza in it. Feeding Habits. Chapter 4. Coup de grâce. The dark room isn't haunted, but a dead man owns it, and he knows exactly where to find him. Through the woods, Lonan skims bushes of gooseberries and wild rhubarb, a gas can sloshing in his hands. Between his teeth, his flashlight brightens the pathway. It is not yet dawn. Eliza will wake up in 30 minutes, which means Lonan has 15 minutes, half the time to destroy it, half the time to walk back to the cabin where she sleeps on the loft, unaware, serene, wrapped in a down parka she found in the closet. He's promised not to enter the dark room without her, and yet he knows this is exactly what he'll do. He shouldn't know where he's going. The forest is so dense and unanimous, a duplication of itself, nothing more than repetitions of the same tree, same flower, same stream. But he doesn't need to see to know where his feet take him. He doesn't even need the flashlight. He's memorized the direction to the dark room like the mandala of veins on his own arm. He's not surprised to see it still stands, as if protected from rain, thunderstorms, the fallen trees that crisscross at the walkway. It's always been a divine place. The air is damp, and particles of mist clog his throat. He sets the gas can in front of the steel panel door with urgency. He does not need to rush, but cannot take his time. Wild flowers burst from in between the shed's concrete foundation, and he knows each species like they've been bred in his blood. Wax flowers, thistles, clusters of asters he'd sometimes gather as a boy and leave in the heart of the forest's most prominent clearings, like an offering or a ransom. Lonan kneels once the first thread of sunlight leaks between the whisper of trees. He is familiar with this forest, the cabin not too far away, the messages the water speaks to him when he sits at its edge most nights, why the darkroom was his father's favorite place and why it always will be. So when sunlight hits his eyes, he presses his fingertips against his lips and looks to the sky for mercy. 7 days earlier, Lonan and Eliza were still in Las Vegas. Eliza woke before sunrise to get ready for her shift at the hospital, and Lonan caught glimpses of her as she dressed, shimmers of stockings, the plasticky clink of emerald costume earrings she can't even wear on the job. Lonan did not tell her of his father's visit on the futon, and Eliza did not ask. A mutual exchange. Lonan rose 20 minutes after the front door slammed shut. That morning, Eliza did not leave her usual dose of energy shots on the counter for him to drink, nor a slice of the stone-like sourdough on a saucer. He instead helped himself to a mandarin she'd brought home in a burlap sack, his fingernails snagging on the ragged material. The morning softened everything. The clinical red smudge of paint splotched on the kitchen wall, the steel railing rusting on the balcony, and even himself. Each feg of mandarin he ground between his incisors burst brilliantly, a lively way to eat. He turned the television onto its usual program while on his last 3 segments and looked on as a herd of caribou dotted a waterway. They moved like the current, pattering along the prairie, worryless, grazing on clouds of reindeer moss. He should have heard the part where a wolf caught up to the herd, the same wolf that would later go on to single out a young fawn and silence it with 2 teeth in its throat like bullet wounds. He should have seen the part where the prey was consumed, its flesh a desperate shade of red, but the thud distracted him. Maybe not even a thud, more like a crash. A sound he felt in his temples, a ringing in his ear like a chickadee. Lonan set the skin of the mandarin onto the coffee table and stood slowly. It's his body that moved him, no force of the mind, toward the balcony. In one movement, he unlocked and shoved open the glass sliding door, rocking it forward with his body weight when it stuck. On his lip, he tasted citrus and salt, a mixture of fruit and sweat. He heard death before he saw it. The way each identical sliding door of the apartment units around him shook open, just like his. What a woman on the sidewalk declared, her tone so shrill he couldn't tell if she was delighted or horrified. Something like, "I thought she was a bird. I thought she was a gift from heaven." The garbled sound of an infant, confused by the sound concrete makes when a human batters it. Anya lay face up. A bouquet of calla lilies protruded from her fist, and though he was 20 feet up, he saw the blood, its ripples from her mouth and onto the sidewalk below. Her body was neatly positioned, as if she had simply laid there because it was sunny that morning and wanted to feel something warm on her throat. She must have done her hair earlier. It sat, adorned in a crown of twists, across her forehead. She was graceful in death, something of an Ophelia. Lonan did not de-escalate the stairs to the ground floor to join the growing crowd. He did not call an ambulance or rush to perform CPR. He ran upward, scaling flights of stairs as if airborne. Once he reached her unit, it was the tin of madeleines he noticed first, sitting unopened, untouched, dare he thought neglected on her welcome mat. It's this that lulled him, freezing him in place for a moment. He recalled nothing of bringing the madeleines to her the evening previous, of leaving them neatly tucked against her straw welcome mat, innocently idle there, his gift unrecognized. Joey sat on the couch. The television was on, projecting Technicolor polygons onto the boy's face. Lonan did not register what it was he watched, which animated shapes pounced and danced on screen. Joey did not cry at first. He sat, staring wondrously at the screen like it was a trap door to a different dimension. The sock secured around his miniature feet looked freshly ironed, and his hair smelled like his mother did when Lonan first met her, like coconuts. The buzzing of onlookers and neighbors sounded like the caribou running. A constant drumming of a snare, a guttural kind of ambience. He thought of Anya the day previous, her desperate excitement to paint over the wall. He thought of the sourdough he never picked up, and there on the counter they sat, one torn down the middle like it was ripped bare-handed, the other skewered with a chef's knife. He thought of Anya's hospitality, her coy excuses to help them both avoid embarrassment, the way each part of her apartment transformed into gold. He thought of their conversation, Anya's initial instruction when she left him alone with her son. So when Joey cried, Lonan knew exactly to reach for the remote and tick the volume up until his sobbing quieted, like the last few minutes of a rainstorm, passionately loud, then stunningly silent. Anya did not physically die. Lonan knows this is fact. Anya will also never walk again. She will be lucky to regain use in one hand, but for now will never be able to feed herself, bake sourdough, paint her kitchen wall, or hold her son again. Anya is a miracle, the newspapers say. Anya is lucky, the neighbors say. Anya was spared, Eliza says. He knows all statements are false. Anya is not a miracle or lucky. She was not spared or given a second chance to make her son's life even better. Anya burned herself into an offering, administered her own kill shot, provoked her own fate, either life or death, and her fate chose neither. The day Anya jumped from her balcony onto the sidewalk below, Eliza took Lonan to his father's cabin. In a daze, he watched her pack a bag with enough things to tide them over for a month, and in that same daze they reached the cabin before sunset. That night, Eliza rifled through the cabinets to put together a meal, and her findings assembled a can of tuna topped with crumbles of saltines, cheap take on a deconstructed pâté. She served him his dinner on a set of plates he vaguely recognized. Terrazzo with a scalloped edge, maybe held a scrambled egg or halved tomato when he was a child. He stared through the French doors, down to the water that padded below. Even when she tried some for herself, putting on her enjoyment in exclamations like, "It's a culinary masterpiece, refined, daring, a little spectacular," she couldn't convince him to eat. His appetite disappeared when Anya fell from the sky. There would be no hunger as penance, as punishment for what he early on determined was his fault. Had he attended dinner, had he handed her the madeleines himself, had he never brought up her husband, had he stayed a few minutes longer after they drank together. The images of the sourdough loaves, both mutilated in either form, told him what Anya thought of him, what Anya thought of people who disappear. "Did you know Anya was suicidal?" he asked Eliza one morning, staring somewhere between the magnolia bush on the porch and the tide. Eliza stopped stirring the instant coffee she'd made herself, grits of sugar pinging off the mug's bottom. "That is not a variable anyone would have known." "But did you know?" Eliza set her stirring spoon in the sink and wrapped her fingers around the brown ceramic mug she dug out from one of the cabinets. The way she held it told him it was not her first time holding it. This was her mug. "Nobody could ever know that, Lonan." He licked his lip, tracing the way the waves by the shore piled over one another, how crashing into something with force must have felt. Eliza sipped her coffee and snapped a stale wafer she'd found left on the counter, the aftermath of the last time the cabin had visitors. "It's my fault she jumped," he said, thinking of the young caribou, its fervid run like it genuinely believed it could outrun its wolf, or in the very least, befriend it. It was not prepared for the truth. She felt abandoned. She felt chased and then marred. Eliza tapped on her mug. "You knew her for one day." The coffee was too hot. Lonan could tell from the face Eliza made after each sip, a sort of suppressed grimace that would eventually turn into a short smile, like she was pretending to enjoy the pain. After a moment, Eliza pushed her hands around his, and though the heat should have caged between her fingers, her hands were still cold. "Anya was very sick. That's why I brought you here, to take you away from that influence. It's like poison for you. Very toxic." "I should have told her husband was coming back, that he'd be home shortly. I should have gone to that dinner." "You didn't want to play into her delusion." "I should have." "You're being unproductive." "I'm being honest with myself," he said, and gestured for her to lift the cup. He leaned forward and she met him halfway, the hot ceramic jolting against his bottom lip. When she tipped the mug, in went the coffee, the liquid praline with sugar, splashing onto the roof of his mouth. He let it cool on his tongue before swallowing, half forgetting what he drank was not Anya's blood or even his own. Lonan knows the fish is not dead. He is 14 but not naive. Sun warms the back of his neck. Maggots shimmer over the gummy slick of the water's surface. Today is what someone would describe as the perfect day. Trees whisper secrets amongst the spines of their leaves. Birds teeter on the neck of birch trees. A butterfly dusts its wings of the shore sand and nips at his childish knuckles. The fish is not dead. This is fact. In his palm, it expands, its gills like the crescent cut of the moon. The fish is not dead. Its mouth kisses the air like it's a divine thing, each blip of its lips greedy, as if the air tastes of gold. The fish is not dead. Its scales grate against Lonan's palms, shimmering. Its prettiness, its last defense mechanism. The fish is not dead. His sun hat shields his eyes, but Lonan doesn't need to see them to know he's lied that the fish are dead. He knows his father will make him kill. Lonan sets the sunfish onto the bed of stone in front of him, uses one hand to hold it steady. The fish does not want to die. It does not want to become a meal. And yet Lonan will kill it, and that is exactly what will be done to it. You're lucky I gave you a dead one, his father says. He lifts the net of fish and meets Lonan at the embankment. Lonan does not feel lucky. The fish is alive, Lonan says, quietly, as if he's whispering it to the dead animal himself. He is not surprised when his father's damp hand secures around his forehead, tugging him parallel to his navel. Lonan's head jerks, his teeth nearly cutting into the gum of his cheeks. Lake water drips into his eyes and down his face like pseudo-tears, the water's salt burning his eyes. Lonan does not move until his father slides a screwdriver onto the stone, perpendicular to the dying fish. It's dead. It does not even know the taste of life. Why save it? I don't want to save it. His father's wedding band digs into his forehead. To an onlooker, it may look like he's about to dip him forward into the water. Not a drowning, but a baptism. What do you want to do with it? Mourn it, he wants to say. Pity it. Sacrifice it. The water whistles ahead of them, all the uncaught sunfish gloriously slashing in the water. They are unaware of their future demise, the current demise of their loved ones, bodies all piled into the net as if on display. Lonan's eyes sting with lake water, a streak of it dripping onto his lips, so when his father reaches over him and secures his hand like a marionette around the screwdriver, he tastes salt and doesn't stop tasting it. We can have mercy on the things we eat, his father says. They're gifts. God likes to give them to us when we behave. Lonan's hand shakes around the screwdriver, but his father's grip does not loosen. Together, they raise the point so it lands just before the fish's eyes, the rod shuddering with Lonan's tremors. It dies for us, his father says, his voice dampened like the distant blip of the lake. So we give it mercy in return. As the screwdriver's tip lowers closer to the fish, Lonan licks his top lip and asks, why do we need to show it mercy if it's already dead? To end the suffering of the wounded. But it's already dead. Even the dead still suffer, his father says. Lonan does not register when the screwdriver impales the fish's brain. He does not register when his father uses both their hands to slit the fish's gills with a hunting knife, or register the warm spurting of its blood up their knuckles. And as he and his father gut and scale the fish, puppet and puppeteer, he imagines the way he'll feel with its head in his mouth. 7 days after Anya jumps off her apartment's balcony, Lonan lies on a pig's leather couch his father once towed in from the city, a damp washcloth doused in eucalyptus essential oil pressed to his forehead. At first, he fears the blinking comes from stars and that the cabin's roof has been removed. But as he comes to, he smells it. The earthy crack of wood, the wisp of smoke, and he knows the light that pulses is a fire. Lonan opens his eyes. As he's thought, he lies on his father's couch, essenced water dribbling down his temples from the washcloth. Eliza sits hunched on the stone of the fireplace's ledge, her shoulders ripening under the orange heat. She's burning something. This he knows for certain. The scent of scorched film is not unfamiliar to him. Like his mouth, it is dry and acrid, like the lick of a battery. You promised, Eliza says, as if sensing he's awoken. Lonan does not move, even as the eucalyptus soak drizzles into his eyes. She is not incorrect. This was their only agreement, not to enter the dark room without the other. Eliza no longer wears the parka. She's stripped to a pearl-lacquered camisole, her feet bare and propped flush against the brick. Glossy red lacquer colors her toenails, reflects the light in ovular patterns along its surface. A false witness shall be punished and a liar shall be caught, she says. Proverbs. Eliza shuffles her deck. He does not have to see what she burns to know what she burns. His hair is damp with sweat. Clumps stick to his forehead, frayed across his face so his vision veils dark. Outside, it started to storm, raindrops dotting the roof. It should smell like earth, like the stomach of pine wood, but all Lonan smells is fire. Are you punishing me, Eliza? She looks at him. Mascara claws down her cheeks, shadow-like rivulets of makeup that settle on her jaw. The ends of her hair are jagged, pooling oblong across her forehead, and not too far away lies a hunting knife the length of her palm. Red lipstick is smudged onto her teeth. It gums when she smiles. Do you feel you're being punished? The darkroom was misplaced. This was Lonan's first thought when he yanked open its steel-paneled door and entered to reveal its contents. He did not need the glimmer of a flashlight to confirm his instinct. This was not the same darkroom he'd known as a child, or the darkroom he found his sister in, or the darkroom him and Harrison tried to destroy. Everything was slotted away, puzzled back into a configuration so unknown to him, so wrong to him, that the organization felt more like war. Unlike when he and Harrison had last stepped foot inside of the darkroom, lugging the gas can along with them, not unlike what he did then, the photos that used to string clothespined in no justifiable order were now taken down. The bricks of photo paper forming a maze around the developing tables, the amber bottles of chemicals, all of it meticulously put back in places Lonan knew they never had. Under his boots, he did not feel the crunch of glass or slip of forgotten negatives. The darkroom had been swept clean. Lonan dropped the gas can at the darkroom's entrance and removed the flashlight from between his teeth, thumbing it off. He worked his way around the shed like he'd been wounded, staggering, stopping to hold himself upright. Nothing was in its rightful chaos. Expired film lay stacked in a waste bin he'd never seen before. Bad paper cuts had been shredded. The photos he'd been so accustomed to not looking at, all gone, except for 3, evenly clipped on the last 3 lines. In the distance, an eagle cawed. The stream trilled. Tadpoles cricketed along the embankment. Lonan approached the remaining photographs like they'd electrocute him. They were displayed one after the other, each on its own line. The first, a picture not unfamiliar to him. Eliza standing in front of a colorful street of vendors, her loopy signature on the back a jagged indication of where she signed it, most likely wobbling on a train or on the back of a taxi. He picked it off its clothespin and held it up to a hole in the roof where sun bled through. Nothing had changed from the photo since he'd stolen it last year, and he was almost grateful she'd left it fossilized when she took it from his pocket. His gratitude did not last by the time he saw the second photo, so unexpected he had to glance twice. His father stood arced slightly behind him, his hands not visible. Lonan knew where they were. One secured round his forehead, the next urging a screwdriver up a stone. Sun scalded the water's surface, wrinkled it with light. He remembered the song his father whistled as he fried the sunfish on a birch branch, truly less of a song and more of a reminder as he hummed up and down each minor scale, not once stopping to check his work, like he knew better than any instrument. Lonan plucked the photograph off the line and held it closer. Though he was shaded mostly by his father's back, he knew they were both in it. He shouldn't have been surprised when he turned it over to find that same looping signature inked onto the back, smudged like she'd forgotten to let the ink dry before handling. It would have been easier to think about the second photo's implications had he not seen the third. He could have excused it, a shot taken by a neighbor, though the cabin was remote. A shot that fired itself, the camera discarded on the ground, though it was taken at eye level. A shot signed with familiar initials, ELK, as if those letters could stand for anything but Eliza Louise Kang. It would have been easier to excuse her presence, to excuse her knowledge of him, to forget she'd ever told him she didn't know his father had children, that she swore she'd never have been with him had someone informed her. It would have been so much easier. The last photo was not a photo at all, not in the same capacity, at least. The ink had gone purplish from the elements but swirled almost horror-like around the photo's frame. He could have pretended the white swishes of color were strands of lace or the awkward scratch of photo blur. He could have pretended to not understand. But there it was, the light funneling down on the black and white shape, so he understood it was not a photograph he looked at, but a child. He shouldn't have been surprised to see that same signature when he turned the picture over. How it gaped on the cardstock, not jittery like the first try, but solid, as if saying, "This one is mine," in 3 letters. "The eagle is your traitor. It gave you away." Eliza's voice warbled like she shouted it from a playground speakerphone. Lonan held all 3 photographs at once, almost a playful jab at a story. The central character first introduced, her main conflict and the seeming end into parenthood, a denouement. It didn't take long for the photos to blend, Eliza swapping places with his father at the lake's edge, the ultrasound lining the streets of her European backdrop. He wanted to forget he'd seen them but couldn't put them down. "You displayed them," he said, shuffling the photos even though he hardly saw what they pictured. "You told me you wouldn't come here alone." He looked at her, the way sun coiled into her eyes, dappling down her arms. He tried to rationalize, to excuse, to understand if anything at all was true. "You've written me a story. You weren't supposed to see them. But this is your showcase." Lonan didn't want to understand what she'd revealed to him. He clipped the photos back up, one by one, and put a hand on his mouth. His fingers tasted like soot. "Did you know I existed before I met you?" Eliza stepped forward. Her expression broke into shards. She touched his face, and he allowed her to. She pushed onto her toes so it was as if she'd risen fully above him and kissed his chin, and he allowed her to. She curdled against his chest, tying them together with a palm pressed where a target on his back would go, and he allowed her to. She grinned when she looked at him, and he turned his face to the ceiling where a hole in the roof caved around a branch. The sun's eye disappeared behind the bullet of the wood, leaving only its outer edges to skirt the sky, a veiling that felt less like an eclipse and more like evidence of an exit wound. Eliza pets each weft of hair before she throws them into the fire. Lonan watches as the flame gouges the gatherings of black, climbing onto each strand like lovers. She whispers to them before settling them in the flame with the ashes of the darkroom's photographs swaddling the fireplace's pit, her whispering sacred, unknowable things. Lonan does not look at her when she secures her fingers around sections of his hair and saws until they return to her palm. He looks only to the fire. "Think of it as re-immersion," she says, the dull end of the knife braying against his skin. She mutters to the weft, smooths her thumb over it, and then discards it in the fire. Christians make baptism seem like such a magnificent thing. A spectacle. But this isn't spectacular. This is just recombination, repotting, stirring to combine. Another wedge of hair releases into her palm, and he winces. Eliza fits her chin against his shoulder, paddling the knife's blade across the stretch of his neck. Her hand tightens around a bundle of his hair, and gently she tugs him closer so the heat of her breath disperses against the metal and onto his scalp. "The woman you speak to on the phone and Anya, they both altered you." She is not incorrect. In the flame, Glenn's face forms, a face so familiar to him, yet it's been so long since he last saw it. Though he truly doesn't know what she looks like, if she's changed her hair, her preference of lip color, or if she wears one at all, her image materializes out of the thick smoke. Beside it, Anya's face flutters, a billowing of smoke that twists across her forehead, just like the style she wore as she descended to the concrete. Eliza cuts off the section of hair at the same time she asks, "How?" Neither woman exists in the smoke. The only person Lonan is guilty of seeing in places he does not exist is his father. He knows he looks only at fire, at his hair burning, biological kindling for Eliza's fuel. But when he utters it, a shuddered, "Children," they both evaporate like they know the taste of betrayal, and he's the ingredient that flavors it. Eliza rakes a hand against his scalp, and in exact fashion as his father, flattens a palm over his forehead and pulls him parallel to her navel. "You want children of your own?" she asks. Children are wicked, are engrossed in their neon television program, want to show you how to flip a toy convertible with their pinky, write operas with rice maracas, follow their fathers, step into each parent's shoes, but at one point pick one to follow like the ugly Y of a wishbone being snapped. His eyes burn with smoke. Eliza pets his forehead like she pets his hair. When he swallows, he cannot distinguish between the air and smoke. They both tangle down his trachea, fumbling to find their place inside. A voice says, "Cry out," and I said, "What shall I cry?" Eliza nuzzles against his ear, and he can't feel where the tip of the knife has gone. "Who are you crying to?" she asks. "You're not a theist," Lonan says. "But I know your language. I've read your book. I know what it says about human fragility somehow made eternal into legacy by God's word. Tell me the rest of the verse since you're a prophet." "I don't know that one well." "You know too much." Eliza lets go of his face, and he sees it then, the blade back in her palm, blood-free, littered with chips of hair. His relief is short-lived. When Eliza shifts a book from under a stack of photos over to him, he knows what she shows him. Him and his father's most prominent hobby partaking at this cabin, their favorite Bible verses printed neatly, repeated enough times to fill one page for every single one. "All people are like grass, and all their faithfulness is like the flowers of the field," he says without once reading what's actually written on the page. Isaiah was onto something, don't you think? Poor grass, poor flowers, they all die in the end, but they have their God, they have their Savior, everything dying except for God and His Word. Eliza cuts another clump of hair. The fire welcomes its feed with haste. "What does this have to do with children?" "Do you feel you're the god of these women, Lonan? Your friend and Anya? Are you their savior?" Lonan shakes his head. "I'm the grass." "So the women are your saviors. You're faithful to them despite knowing your outcome if you are." "I don't see it like that." Eliza places the butt of the knife into Lonan's palms. Fire flickers against the blade and colors it like a sunset. Its weight pins his hand to the hearth of the fireplace. He knows what he's being asked to do without her even telling him. After they eat the fish, Lonan and his father rinse their hands in the lake. This is respect. This is self-ordinance. This is a holy act. His father stoops farther into the stream than he does, water nipping his knees. The sun has disappeared beyond the horizon, the sky now colored periwinkle, silvering his father's hair. The taste of sunfish coddles Lonan's tongue, oiled and briny with salt water. They share a bar of orange glycerin soap, its scent cloying like a rotting fruit basket. His father peels the bar between his palms, scrubbing until his fingers disappear under suds. Lonan knows what to do when he's handed the bar and copies this mechanism of cleansing. Across the water, his father's voice shimmers. "When the Lord was about to feed 5,000, what did he tell his disciples?" Lonan doesn't know the answer. His father studies the Bible like he studies the current for any subtle movement of prey, like he studies his eyes in the bathroom mirror. He scrapes the glycerin bar against his knuckles, like the suds will voice the answer for him. He scratches each fingernail for impurities, poring over each pore of skin, each sprout of hair on his arm for safekeeping. Lonan doesn't stop coating the soap between his hands, even when his father secures 2 fingers around his throat and pulls him close, just like he did against his forehead. Lonan swallows, and the heat of his father's hand pulses as his Adam's apple bobs. He said, "Bring them here to me." The moon has begun to take the sun's place, its white stomach like a flag of surrender. Do you know why? His father's grip tightens to a point where he can't breathe. As Lonan fights to inhale, each parting of his lips a glorious yet desperate victory, like swallowing air made of gold, his father increases pressure around his throat until both edge closer to the water pooled around their ankles. When he next speaks, his father's voice is so close it brushes the hair on the nape of his neck. Because they doubted him, he says, and with all of his weight, forces both himself and his son into the mouth of the lake. So that's the end of this chapter. I hope you guys enjoyed. Chapter 4 is pretty intense, and chapter 5 is definitely intense too. Look out for the final chapter in Lonan's point of view, and then we're going to jump into Harrison's head. This is my favorite chapter of all of Feeding Habits, so I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!